Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to our next webinar from the Center Economic Strategies. Together with the German economic team, we have invited you to join the presentation of our common research, How to Revive Banking Lending During the War. My name is Maria Rybko. I'm the Deputy Head of the Center for Economic Strategy, and today I will be your moderator. So, albeit the stability and flexibility of the banking system during the full-scale invasion, we can see not everything is so perfect with lending in private sector, in lending with corporations, it continues to stagnate. And during this event, we would like to present you with the results of the analysis that we have done as analytics of SES related to the lending. Our ladies have done really a great work from the econometric analysis of all the factors that which we believed could impact on lending, on the market, and also we will present to you our recommendations.
If you want to listen to this event in English, please switch on the translation in your bottom panel in Zoom. You will be able to do this.
So let me briefly talk about our schedule. In the first place, I would like to ask Kateryna Rozhkova, First Deputy Head of the NBU, and Mr. Robert Kirchner, Deputy Head of the German Economic Team, for introduction words. Then SES Analytics will present their research, and then everybody who is listening to us, colleagues, I really encourage you to join into the discussion, comment what you will hear, give some fresh opinions from your side, because exactly for this, we wanted to put this together in order to hear the feedback, in order to hear your opinion. Possibly it will be also like ours, maybe it will be different, and together try to clarify which policies of the central bank during the war can improve lending. So this was maybe a long introductory word, and I would like to pass the floor to Kateryna Rozhkova. Kateryna is the first deputy governor of the NBU. Kateryna, the floor is yours. Thank you, colleagues. Welcome to everybody. In the first place, I would like to thank the SES team for what we will hear and what we will see today, and I would like to welcome everybody who is watching our webinar. This topic is really, truly important. And this is right. Indeed, the full-scale invasion has negatively affected lending, although the banks didn't stop lending at all, even at the beginning of the full-scale invasion. At that time, lending was conducted at the expense of the state support programs. That's the rate compensations, this is guarantees, and that has allowed, let's put it this way, to support our biggest strategic economy sectors, such as agriculture. Although if we talk about the market lending, which should have been in a different, more or less, business as usual financial system. So because of the high risks since the start of the full-scale invasion, it has really slowed down. And we, as the National Bank, the Minister of Finances, the Minister of Economy, and the Banking Association, all this time we were trying to find ways how, let's put it this way, how to support market lending, which mechanism we could use, which instruments we could use, which steps we should take. In the beginning of the full-scale invasion, let me remind you that the National Bank has adopted a number of decisions which have eased the requirements in terms of the assessment of the credit risks in the banking sector. Then we made some decisions which vice versa, simplified things and improved the coefficients of collateral coefficients of the collateral that was meant to increase the risk appetite of the banks and to simplify the clients' access to banking lending. Last year, together with the colleagues from the government, we adopted a strategy to support lending during the war. And it was approved by the Council of Financial Stability. And basically today we can already talk about certain results of the strategy. Although, according to the latest data, the net grivna lending for the business is growing in pace like 29% year to year. The population, the rate of the population lending exceeds 30%. With this, we have the decrease of the share of loans issued at the expense of the state support. If in the beginning of the full-scale invasion 1 year ago, for instance, their share was in the general lending portfolio around 40%, now it's less than a third. The market conditions for lending are improving, although the war is still ongoing, thanks to the preservation of the macro's financial stability. Because of the good liquidity, enough equity, the banks are proposing acceptable market conditions for the clients, and to a great extent, these conditions are already comparable with the conditions which are proposed by the state support program. Whether we still have in these areas some room for improvement, some open issues, of course they remain. Of course, we would like that lending would continue to grow. And although today we are fixing that these are all banks and all sectors of economy are already getting loans under the market conditions, at the same time, we understand that we started from the low base because there was a huge fall of the lending since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And of course, we understand that the war continues to remain the biggest risk, both for the market in general and for the banking sector, although economy and business have adapted to these conditions. That's why it is so important to really talk about those obstacles that still remain, to make sure that with common effort we could make everything possible in order to mitigate their negative influence and to provide for the further growth of lending and the support of economy through the banking sector. At this, allow me to complete my short introduction. I'm sure that this research will be very much interesting to everybody. That's why thank you, Maria, thank you, colleagues, ready to enjoy the results of your research. Thank you, Ms. Kateryna. Truly, it was very interesting for us. We are very much thankful to the National Bank for the cooperation and that the data was provided to us. And we really hope that the data-based policies will continue to be the priority for the NBU. And I would like to pass the floor to Robert Kirchner. He is the head of the German economic team. This is our economic advisor from the German government to the Ukrainian government. Robert, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Maria, and good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Robert Kirchner. I'm the deputy head of the German economic team, which is an economic policy advisory project that has been working for many, many years in Ukraine and is financed by the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy. It's really an honor for me today to open the webinar co-hosted with the Center for Economic Strategy and the German economic team. Thank you to everyone who could join us, especially, obviously, to the first deputy governor of the National Bank of Ukraine, Kateryna Rozhkova, and her team, but also to our experts that will present the key findings of our comprehensive report in a few minutes. Over the next hour or so, we will dive deep into corporate lending trends in Ukraine amid the war. And despite the remarkable resilience and the stability that has been demonstrated by the banking sector, corporate lending still remains relatively stagnant, held back by different factors: rising interest rates, banks' cautious balance sheet strategies, competing instruments like bonds, government bonds, NCDs, and other factors. And that matters because corporate lending is crucial for maintaining business operations, financing reconstruction, and facilitating the economic recovery of Ukraine. And that's why today's presentation and the discussion to follow carry significant weight. This event is not merely about diagnosing what happened, it is equally about moving forward. I just would like to encourage all participants, speakers, and audience alike to share their candid perspectives, views, questions, opinions, and experiences so that we have a fruitful discussion. With that, I'll pass over to Maria for the moderation of the event. I look forward to really a rich, constructive discussion. Thank you.
Many thanks, Robert, and thank you for the support of this research, and thank you for your work in Ukraine as the German economic team. And now, what will be happening, sort of a few housekeeping issues. The ladies from the Center of Economic Strategy, they will present their research. Kateryna will remain with us, Robert will remain with us in case you have any questions to them. You can also ask them in the Q&A and also in chat of the Zoom. And I believe that we can also write questions. We're now having the direct Facebook ongoing. You can also ask questions in Facebook, and my colleagues, the presentation, the results of the research would be sent to everybody who registered. They are also available at the website. After this event is complete, maybe in some hours. With this, I would like to say a few words about the research itself, about the note itself. It was built in such a way in order to analyze and to identify trends in the corporate lending for these three different views. It's from the point of view of the supply side, the proposal of loans, also from the banks, which banks are there, which interests are there, and why is that, why this or the other cluster of the bank can respond to different challenges of the wartime. It's about, do they see the possibility for military risks? It's important that they have access to loans or not, or vice versa, they feel the lack of funding, the lack of access to financial resources. Otherwise, they would have bigger terms. And the third is it's the crowding out effect. That's the and crowding out effect. And the state securities that the government places at a high rate can substitute at the banking balance the corporate loans in case the bank will believe that this very little risk asset is the alternative for the corporate lending. It can also pertain to deposit certificates, and this 1 year ago, this discussion was quite hot in the Ukrainian public space. That's why 3 points of view, 3 approaches we have discussed, and I would like to ask my colleagues to present the research. First of all, I would like to ask Maria Tomilina to take the floor. Maria, the floor is yours. So let us start with the background, and I would like to say that at this moment, the state banks own more than 50% of the gross assets. They spread across 5 institutions, and there is a moderate level of concentration by regional standard after 2 waves of nationalizations. This happened after 2 waves of nationalization and liquidation of the insolvent banks. There was a first wave between 2015 and 2017. Privatbank and some smaller banks were nationalized, and the second wave already happened in 2022, in the beginning of the full-scale invasion. The significantly important Science Bank was nationalized, and in general, although this sector is not highly concentrated, enhancing competition remains quite important. And in case we talk about short-term focus, then it has to be a certain concentration on major banks and long-term support for small players to foster a more dynamic lending environment. In case we look at the this second at the left lower corner, if we look at the share of corporate loans to total assets, we can see that the trend continues. What we see from 2014 and This was most important because the war has started. Then we had, unfortunately, COVID and the full-scale invasion. And then we can see that in 2022, there was a sharp decrease of GDP. And we also had the banks started to think what to do with their assets. And I would like to go back to the section which I personally analyzed, that's the cost of borrowing. That's where we have used the econometric analysis to examine how corporate lending rates, as well as government bond rates and deposit certificate rates, how they affect lending. We built 3 ARDL models for the period between October 2017 to April 2025 in order to identify which factors impact most on new loan volumes and what policy implications could be provided. And let us start from the corporate lending rates, as we see on the graph, and this is the period of time, the period of the full-scale invasion. We can see how much was the corporate lending dropped significantly of the private loans for evident reasons, but albeit of this, that in 2023-2024, lending kept growing 24 and 25, supported by increased economic stability and early policy easing. And also market lending expanding despite a key rate increase. This was also improving in the earlier, not improving, but lowering the key rate has successfully improved that, because this was the need for that. After that, there was a slow decrease, but also we saw in 2025 was somewhat higher, but irrespective of this, lending continues. In general, the built model, we looked at the corporate lending rates. We also looked at such a factor as the war, and exactly this factor of the war showed to us that it has a bigger impact than the rates themselves. How we can understand this? Based on the model, we saw that in case the rate, loan rate, rates have a certain lag and it grows by 1%, it leads that the lending rate will go down by 0.04% per month for the full war period since the start of the full-scale invasion and all the way to April, while the war leads to a 0.15% drop per month. So there's quite a significant difference. But also this before the invasion, we also compared the corporate lending rate. It was somewhat lower, and this rate was higher at that time. This lending rate could explain, I mean, after the invasion, the effects slightly increased, but the models. The next one is about government bonds. We said that crowding out effect takes place, and since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, it's very evident that the government bond rates grew, and then the question comes up whether really the banks moved to a more secure income making, and in reality, our model has proved that we looked at 2 periods of the full-scale invasion, immediately from March 2022 and until April 25. And the second section we looked, it's from January to April. And if we look at the whole section, then this crowding out effect was available starting from the January 2023. became once again insignificant how it used to be before the full-scale invasion. So this was a very interesting insight from our modeling. In this model, we also looked at the impact of the war, and still the war has a stronger impact, even compared to what we looked at, reducing loan volumes by 0.2% per month in the same model. So the difference between the rate of government bonds and the loan rates. And the last issue from this block is deposit certificates. In reality, we can look here. I was also looking at the spread. They're quite close to the government bonds in the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but then, in general, as the results of our model showed, there was a certain crowding out effect existed even before the full-scale invasion. It was not significant at all. It actually has remained more or less the same since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, but in general, we tested this. It showed a stronger effect in terms of impact on lending. That's why, coming to some implications and summaries, I'd like to say that lending rate still matters and it's good, but its influence is smaller than war-related factors. That's why, in general, when we say about we have to really emphasize on how we can reduce loan volumes, war-related risks, in order to support our lending, because this will be much more effective than just going down with the key rate. Also, other important things, it's of course the focus on reducing war-related risks. War remains the strongest constraint on lending. Policies such as government-backed loan insurance, war risk insurance, stronger borrower support, credit guarantees, and such instruments as donor-funded risk-sharing tools, all of this could help restore confidence and ease credit access. As already said about these deposit certificates, they had a limited impact before, so it doesn't make sense to focus on them significantly. And we talk about government bonds, then at this moment we don't see this significant impact. There was this temporary crowding out effect which appeared in the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Now it faded out, but we have to really monitor this interaction between the government-supported lending and the credit activity in order to support long-lasting effect. We understand that at this period of time, government bonds is also one of the important instruments for the banks. Then I'm passing the floor to Iana, who will say about the supply side. Many thanks. In the first place, what we have defined is that the banks have demonstrated really different behaviors related to corporate lending, and that was significantly shaped by their ownership structure. We analyzed a lot of potential factors that could influence that, the size of the bank, the profitability, and some others, but it turned out that the structure of ownership really explains it for the best. In case we talk about the dynamics of the corporate lending, meaning the ratio between the corporate lending to assets, then between 2014 and 2017, Ukrainian private banks have demonstrated or had demonstrated the highest ratio of corporate loans to total assets. At the same time, state-owned banks significantly lagged behind. In the end of 2018, also within 2019, reacting to the renewed stability in this sector, foreign banks, international banks, they took the lead in terms of the ratio of corporate loans to total assets. Although this trend was quickly reversed at the outset of the full-scale Russian invasion in the early 2022. Foreign banks scaled back corporate lending, going down within ratio of corporate loans to total assets. At the same time, the state-owned banks expanded their corporate lending. With this, Ukrainian private banks maintained a relatively steady corporate lending ratio, a small stagnation, but later this trend stabilized until the end of 2022. That's why, in case we make this generalized conclusion from these descriptive statistics, the bank ownership structure did matter. It has really affected the differences in trends of corporate lending, especially that after the start of 2022, to put it briefly, the foreign banks significantly retreated in terms of corporate lending, while the state-owned banks, vice versa, they expanded. And when it comes to the Ukrainian private banks, we saw a gradual stagnation, but this trend has already stabilized. The next slide, please.
Маш, наступний слайд.
So, in case we move to a more well-grounded econometric analysis about the factors that influence corporate lending in various groups of the banks, then we can, as was already mentioned, we considered three groups separately. First is state-owned, next is private Ukrainian, and then the foreign banks. This classification coincides with the classification of the NBU. And since we analyze a long period of time, throughout which there was a change in policies, change of reporting standards among the banks and the like, then we need to concentrate on some fundamental financial indicators. It's about short-term liquidity, capital adequacy, ratio of the capital to assets, as well as profitability, return on assets, and we analyze how these indicators affected the propensity to corporate lending. And that's where we say about the change in the corporate lending to assets ratio. Since this data demonstrated significant structural gaps, significant changes in the level of these parameters, significant changes how these parameters impact corporate lending, we are dividing the whole period into three sub-periods. That's what we call the early period. That's the period of reforms, market cleansing from insolvent banks, the banks that didn't show enough financial resilience. This was between 2014 and 2018. Then came 2019, 2021. It's about destabilization and institutional strengthening at the NBU. And the last period, 22 to 25, that's when we talk about the wartime banking and some emergency measures and certain extraordinary measures to stabilize the financial system. Since the data itself have lots of noise and we see lots of structural gaps, we have used the Bayesian linear models method, and we have specified weekly informative priors that has allowed us to make it such a model that could explain very clearly the relevant trends, even with some low quality data, which are caused by lots of factors, including the change in the reporting standards, outliers, and the like. We have added interaction between the main numerical changes, liquidity, level of capital, and profitability, and all these three periods. And we have used the data, microdata, for all Ukrainian banks from 2014 to 2025. We have harmonized this data. They are in the quarterly expression. And I would also like to add that those banks that were liquidated, they were excluded from the analysis because since the beginning of the analysis, we assumed that their behavior would be abnormal and would be caused by other factors, such as the desire to preserve financial stability or to provide high profitability. At the same time, the banks that were nationalized, they appear in the subsection of the banks with state ownership from the moment of their nationalization. That's briefly about methodology, so let us come to some key outcomes, and it's the next slide. So, in case we take into account just the statistical results, then for the banks from the international banking groups, liquidity showed no effect on corporate lending. We could see a very weak negative effect of capital adequacy and profitability in the early period. More stable and profitable banks, they avoided corporate lending in the early period, but this trend reversed modestly over time. And in case we compare foreign banks with the state-owned banks and with Ukrainian private banks, we can see that foreign banks are predominantly shaped by external constraints. They're not entirely immune to domestic financial conditions, while these external factors, such as the policy of the mother banks, the barriers for capital, they most likely will play a more significant role. With the state-owned banks, it's quite an interesting situation. This used to be one single group of banks where we could prove the hypothesis that since the start of the full-scale invasion, they increased their corporate lending propensity. This coincides with the trend that we talked about in the beginning of this block. During the war, state-owned banks with a higher capital adequacy ratio. We are talking about the ratio of capital to assets. They decrease corporate lending propensity compared to the early period. So in a certain way, they try to avoid this. And in case we talk about the influence on profitability, it remained weak and statistically inconsistent. At the same time, Ukrainian private banks, the situation looks quite interesting because their behavior is the behavior that we can expect from the market agents. They are responding to change in profitabilities. At the same time, we have to mention that in the early period, in the period of transformation, the banks with the higher profitability, they gave more corporate loans relatively, but during the war, this effect to a great extent weakened. So the private banks, they are responding to military risks, and possibly this could be a key for the increase of the corporate lending among the private banks. At the same time, if we talk about the capital adequacy in the earlier period, private banks with higher capital adequacy ratio tended to lend less to corporations. This effect was weaker during stabilization, but again, this effect also shifted in the last period of 22 to 25. So, speaking conditionally, the war has significantly impacted on how private banks with high capital adequacy ratios, more aggressive to risks, how they are issuing corporate loans. In case we make a general summary, we can say that the banks of foreign international groups, they are less affected by the domestic policies. At the same time, state-owned banks are responding to the priority of the state. On the one hand, they have increased lending. although at the same time they have increased the number of government bonds in their portfolios. That's why for them, during the war, the banks with the higher capital ratio demonstrate lower propensity to corporate lending, and Ukrainian private banks, they are the biggest market-based agents compared to other banks because they really respond to profitability very accurately, although they also respond to risk. That's why the positive effect of profitability on corporate lending, it was not significant during the war. The actual weekend. So, making a short summary, let's come to some policy implications. Foreign international banks, they remain largely detached. They are independent from what is happening in Ukraine. Their propensity to corporate lending, on the one hand, it is influenced by the level of stability in the Ukrainian economy. On the other hand, they are very much conditioned by the strategies of the mother banks, and because of that, their corporate lending has significantly decreased after the start of the full-scale invasion. With this, private Ukrainian banks, they respond very actively to market signals. For them, profitability has played a significant role for the decisions about the corporate lending during the war, and during the war, this effect has decreased. So once again, the banks are responding to a high level of risk, and in case we talk about the state-owned banks, they have the biggest potential in order to increase corporate lending, but at the same time, the banks with the most adequate level of capital, they're demonstrating the propensity risks, and they have a significant share of government bonds in their portfolios, and this could be addressed by the changes in the state policy about these banks. So from my side, this is it. Many thanks. Passing to Maria. Let's continue with the demand side. In general, the investment appetite of business is constrained by some unmanageable risks, such as something that you can't. And this increased shelling, power outages, labor shortages, and weak consumer demand. And you can see from the left, right, we can see that limited access to loans is not a top concern for businesses, indicating that credit availability is not seen as a major constraint. In general, companies are more concerned about their ability to repay loans, and they turn to banks credit only after they have used up other cheaper options, such as grants or own funds. And in general, we expected in terms of where they would need the money, but the ones who received banking loans, they remain more or less the same. And at the same time, the companies give and what is alternative for them, it's more key obstacles. Also, the risks that are connected with the war, the demand for loans can grow, and this actually emphasizes the necessity in searching instruments and policies and conducting policies that will lower the risks in order to provide bigger security and predictability. And also, before we also We would like also to add that access to lending has actually improved since mid-2023, with SMEs benefiting more due to smaller financing needs and lower perceived risks. Large firms, they have faced stricter lending due to lower asset values and tighter bank. And because of the more tighter bank policies, highlighting the need to balance access with financial stability. So, in case we look at this general situation, how loan distribution in Ukraine, we can see that it remains uneven across industries and business sizes. For instance, the biggest share of the outstanding loans, the first is the biggest share of loans, it's within trade, processing, and agriculture. And loan distribution varies by size. The medium size businesses lead in most sectors, large ones in mining and science. And the micro enterprise loans, they are heavily concentrated in trade, while large firms remain focused on trade and processing. So, going to our policy implications, we will have some repetition from what has already been said. And in the first place, once again, as a conclusion, from the previous slides, we have the decrease of risks connected with the war, because the war remains one of the most important obstacles to lending, and it decreases we can see that the war remains the most significant drag on credit, reducing loan volumes by more or less from 0.12 to 0.21. Policy measures such as government-backed loan insurance, war risk insurance, and targeted support for borrowers can really be more effective in reviving lending than just simply rate cuts. Of course, special focus should be placed on de-risking tools to small and medium-sized businesses. What we have recollected about 579 program, which should be targeted at the ones who actually need it. These are the companies who are concentrated on the territories which are closer to the front line. And also, that should also improve enterprise bankability. We say that it's important to provide SME training in finance and credit applications with donor support, because lots of companies face that, especially smaller companies, how in general how they can receive this loan, because we can see that a huge share of loans can be a problem just because something was not fully or not completely properly completed. We should mobilize state-owned and foreign banks. We are considering a launch of some targeted loan schemes for state-owned banks. Also some shift from USBs, from government bonds to productive lending, and extending guarantee programs to foreign banks to restart corporate lending. And in general, in the end, I would like to mention that we have to monitor financial market conditions. As I already said in this part, that the crowding out effect from government bonds was quite present in the beginning of the year, and it became insignificant thereafter. Nevertheless, we have to be quite careful and continue monitoring to make sure that we could make sure that ensure balanced credit market development. That's it from my side. Many thanks.
Дякую, Марія.
Thank you, Maria.
Марія, дякую, Яна,
Thank you,
дякую
Maria.
вам
Thank you,
обом.
Iana.
Мені
Thank you to
здається,
all of you.
що ви
It seems
зробили
to me that
дуже
you have
велику
done
роботу,
really a
і
huge
для
work,
того, щоб,
and in order for
власне,
us,
ми могли
we could
більш ґрунтовно її
be more
обговорити,
well-grounded and
зрозуміти
talk
плюси-мінуси та
about
policy
pluses and
implications,
minuses and policy
висновки для
implications,
публічної політики, які з цих
the
цифр
conclusions for the
випливають.
public policies that
Ми
come from these
попросили
figures. We have
попередньо кількох
asked
людей експертів
preliminary a few
продивитися
experts
презентацію та,
to look at the
можливо,
presentation
чи
beforehand
будуть вони
and
зараз
possibly
готові
whether they will be
прокоментувати
ready
ваші
to comment
результати,
now your
прокоментувати
results,
те,
to
що було
comment
почуто
something that
зараз.
was
Колеги, я
heard now.
прошу вас
Colleagues,
піднімати
please
руки,
raise your
якщо
hands
у вас є
in case you have
коментарі або
any
питання,
comments
і
or
наша
questions,
комунікаційна
and our
команда дасть
communication
вам
team
можливість
will give you the
висловитися.
possibility to talk.
Я знаю, що тут
I know
є
that we
зараз
have
з нами в
here
Zoom кілька
in
людей,
Zoom
які
several people
можуть і
who
хочуть
can and who wish
прокоментувати
to
почуте. Будь ласка,
comment what was
піднімайте
heard.
руки.
Please raise your hand.
І так, я бачу одна рука.
I can see one
Дмитро і
hand.
колеги,
Dmitro
реагуйте,
and
піднімайте
colleagues,
руки,
do
будемо
please
просити
respond.
вас
Raise your hands,
запускати в
and
ефір.
we will be
Дмитро
letting
Кроковець,
you. Dmitro
Київська
Krukovets,
школа
Kyiv School of
економіки.
Economics.
Дмитро, будь ласка.
Dmitro, the floor is yours. Welcome, everybody. Many thanks for this very interesting presentation. Super important subject, because lending definitely is the fuel for the economy, and it will be really interesting for us to understand what in general could be done to make sure we can revive lending, especially during the potential recovery once the war is over and when we win. I have several questions of more technical nature. I didn't want to be first ones because they're quite technical. And since we started, in the first place, I want to say that grouping by the ownership is a great idea, and the impact on this interrelationship, that in various groups you can monitor different behavior. I can recollect of the article of some expert in 2016. He classified the banks using their policy and their strategy. That's why banks can have different strategy. This may not really depend on ownership, mostly from ownership, but not only. So possibly we can try to make some clusterization to repeat that paper. And in terms of the strategies of the bank, how they are making lending, and more or less repeat this exercise. Maybe it will give you some new insights. That's my first comment. Number two, in reality, I wanted to see more the RDL specification. I understand there was certain changes in there, especially about the war. Do you understand it? It's 0 before the war and 1 after. Yes, this is right. I heard very often the criticism that the war, this was a one-off effect, and it acted only throughout the second and the third quarter of 2022. Then it stopped to act, and some other effects took place, like energy problems, distractions, general distractions as the second effect. And there is a sense to try in this specification to play with this change and to make this data for the first quarter, and then to add some other changes that could also depend on the war, but more exact. And also, I have in the Kyiv School of Economics, we have now the thesis defended, and in one of these theses, I saw that they used the data from ECLET about the intensity of the military activities per region, and the idea about the intensity of hostilities can also work. This is just for you to think about. Okay, and my third comment and a question about the crowding out effect. I didn't really understand fully the specification, but possibly there are certain limits to how much can the bank take. Of course, they can't take it unlimited. They have to simply direct the funds to lending. So the system of debt certificates, bonds, it is built in such a way that these deposit certificates, there should be a certain volume of deposits in order that they will be able to take deposit certificates. So there could be some relationship which is subject to consideration. My fourth question, I just wanted to clarify which in the Bayesian model, which drivers do you take?
Ви маєте на увазі конкретні вартості?
You mean specific values? There are several types of these priors.
Колеги, якщо треба, може
Colleagues,
покажеш Маші слайди зі
you
специфікаціями.
can show them slides with specifications which we hit.
Зараз можу.
Yes, I can show that. Just a second.
Поки Маша шукає слайди,
While Maria
колеги,
is searching for
запрошую
slides,
знімати
colleagues, I would
руку,
like to
якщо
ask you
ще
to raise
хтось
hands
спосіб
in case somebody else is ready to comment on the results. Possibly you have some ideas how to put them in the policy making. After the colleagues analytics will give the answers to Dmitro. I believe we can come to some next comments. Is that right? I have two more questions, small questions. I just don't know how much time we have. We have half an hour left, so everything is quiet. I think it will be enough time for everybody. Yes, thank you so
Я
much.
так розумію, що я можу дати відповідь на питання, поки...
So I think I can answer a question while Maria is searching.
Власне, так, перепрошую, я забула.
Yes, apologies. I forgot this prior was the centering on zero.
Наскільки я розумію, це
So to the extent I understand, this was more or less a standard practice, also took into account
скажімо так, параметри
that the parameters of ratio, they are also somewhat constrained with certain points from 0 to 1, most likely. So basically, good, clear, thank you.
Тоді щодо
So
дивіться, насправді
let's see.
я брала як єдиний
So I took as the impact of the war. This was a good idea to divide it into several different effects. We looked at some monthly data. We looked at the rates, loan rates. There is a certain lag there, and also a certain number of observations which can't be. More changes are necessary. And when we talk about, for instance, crowding out effect, yes, I understand that there are certain limitations in terms of how we can take how much government bonds we can take. There are certain benchmark government bonds, but just a second. But in general, in addition to that, we didn't see, there are 4 periods in here. We didn't see it that much. So all the observations from October 17 to April 25th, but this period from February to April, this was a short-term effect. So we can say that the first 8-10 months of the full-scale invasion, it was quite, let's put it this way, it was a big shock of the war, very big shock. And exactly in that shock, the banks started, it is evident that not that many people were ready to build up any plans, and as a consequence, the banks came to some more crowded out rates. That's when the key rate was increased, and the government bonds rates were one of the highest. So all these factors have led to what we had in that period of time. So we can see the availability of this effect, but also we are saying not only about the government bonds, but the difference between this spread between government bonds rate and lending rates. Conditionally, in case this spread is high, conditional figures. So this 5% of the spread, we are seeing how it affects the volume of lending. The higher it is, it will represent that the lending rates, lending volumes will decrease. That's if we talk through the mathematical explanation. Makes sense. Thank you so much. Then another question immediately. There was analysis in banking groups in the second part of this presentation. How did you do these models for banking groups? You said that there is a separately for each of the banks. Separately for each banking group. These are the results. So we have this sample, the international banks, state banks, and private banks, the private Ukrainian banks. Here we have only the results where credible level is consistent. So let's put it this way. It was either negative or negatively neutral, but it's not like from -3, from minus 0.3 to plus 0.5. We use it as a criteria to say something very definite about the direction of this effect. But we have also full results, they are researched. The table would not fit here because the model also included the interaction effect. Colleagues, we have 3 more people who agreed to make a comment and to give their possible reflections to the recommendations, possible recommendations to the results of the research. So let's try 5-7 minutes to go over for each person who is ready to comment. I can see Roman and Victor. Please, colleagues, give the possibility to talk. So let's start from Roman. Roman was the first. Many thanks to the CES team for this very interesting research, to the very actual topic. And it's very positive. I can see that it's very much oriented to some long-term empirical data, this microanalysis approach, also this comprehensive and systematic consideration of the problems in lending from all 3 focuses of the analysis. That's really a great strength of this research. At the same time, during presentation, I had a number of recommendations for the further development of this research, because I understand that the Center of Economic Strategies permanently, in case you take some topic, you are being quite traditionally, you continue this research and you constantly improve them. So first that comes to my mind is the role of the liquidated banks who were in the first periods of your analysis. It was quite significant to the point that, in my opinion, it's not worth abstracting from this segment of the analysis, because 14, 15, and 16, they played a huge role in the banking system, although definitely that's why they were liquidated, because they had certain problems. At that time, they were part of the market and they really defined the lending that we are analyzing now. The second is the composition of each of the groups of the banks by the type of owners, because this aspect was researched. So the composition of each of the groups, borrowing, state-owned, and private, it is quite different numbers. It's not really heterogeneous. It's not uniformly distributed, these indicators. And starting from the size of these banks, And in some groups, there are several big banks, private banks, and the rest are much smaller in size. So, in my opinion, to operate exclusively median values without taking into account these peculiarities, or using the methods of clusterization inside of these groups during research, this could be not really proper. Because there is this lack of homogeneity in each of these groups by the type of owners. So it's desirable not to take just a median, or to look in more detail on the distribution inside of these groups. Next, there is a certain problem. Our pain for all economists, we're doing the sectoral analysis, that the classification by sectors of the borrowers, it is tied to QVETs, to the number of registration numbers. There is a huge share of trade, not because all the borrowers are doing trade, but because the main classification number is trade. But each of them, if you look in more detail, you can bring to one or the other financial and industrial groups who have their own specialization in agriculture or in metallurgy, but by default, their first registration classification number is trade. So it's worth to make a better distribution, looking at some microdata. I mean, the company for whom I work, Control, we can help in making more detailed breakdown by sectors to make sure that this trade would not be the biggest, because behind trade there are quite a lot of sectoral companies, various sectors of economy. Also, the processing industry, it's another example of such section where in reality half of the industries are hidden by this name processing. It will be more interesting to look at it in a to better understand who is behind this processing. I would also like to agree with Dmitro that it would be very interesting to have an additional approach, applying not only the types of owners, but also the types of banks by business model, about what we had articles, and Dmitro mentioned from Mr. Rozhkova.
Дякую дуже, Романе. Ну, я
Many
підтверджую,
thanks,
що
Roman. I
Control
can only
це
support
такий
that you
хостинг. Я
control.
багато
It's
користуюся
really
там
a
з іншою
super
метою, і
space.
це справді
I'm
це
using you a
надзвичайно
lot, and this
класний
is really
спосіб,
the
найзручніший
best. This is
для
one of the
детального
most
шукання
convenient
для
sources of
когось,
data about the
вважаєте за
companies
безкоштовну
which I ever
рекламу.
used.
Дякую дуже вам за коментар. Дівчата, ви хочете
Apologies if
реагувати?
I advertise you free of charge. Ghost, you want to
Так,
comment?
якщо можна, я дуже коротко.
In case
Дуже
you're ready,
дякую.
very briefly, many
Насправді, типу
thanks.
банків за бізнес-моделями це
The types of
дуже
banks
цікава ідея. Тобто, насправді ми обмежилися
by
тим,
business
що
models is a
ми
very interesting idea.
проаналізували,
We
наскільки
have
ця
analyzed
класифікація за
how this
основними
classification
фінансовими показниками
by main
буде збігатися за
indicators will coincide.
класифікацією за типом власності. Вони були досить подібні і,
They were
власне,
quite
це ми
similar,
задовольнилися. Тому, можливо, це
and
буде
we were quite
цікаво
satisfied
як
with this.
подальший
So it
етап
will be very much
дослідження.
interesting as the next
Щодо
stage of the
ліквідованих
research. And in terms of
банків, ми
liquidated banks,
їх
we
аналізували.
have analyzed
Тобто ми
them.
дійшли до висновку,
We
що
have come to a
вони мали
conclusion
досить
that they had
високий рівень
quite a high
корпоративного
level
кредитування,
of
тому
corporate
що є інші
lending,
банки, що
higher than others,
пояснюється
which
їх,
explains
скажімо
partially
так,
this
низькою якістю управління.
low
Бізнес-моделі.
quality business model. But we're talking about
управління, недооцінкою
the low
ризику, в якійсь
quality
мірі і так
of
далі. Але так
business
як
model,
все-таки
some
наше дослідження
underestimation of
більш
risk, but
направлено
still,
на те, що
since
робити в
our
майбутньому, то ми вирішили,
research is
що
more
ми
aimed at what we should do in the
відмовимося від цієї
future,
частини.
we decided we
Просто
will
тому,
refuse
що
from
на
this
даний
part
момент
because
сектор
at this
вже
moment
достатньо
this sector
чистий.
is
Тобто були
quite
якісь,
cleansed.
здається, один випадок
There
після
was some one
повномасштабного
case
вторгнення.
after the
Один
start of the full-scale
націоналізація,
invasion,
один ліквідація.
one
В принципі,
nationalization,
зараз
one
банківський
liquidation, but
сектор,
more or less now the banking
він досить
sector,
в порядку, тому
it's very much in
ми
good
впевнені,
order.
наскільки це релевантно.
So we were
Але
not
для
sure whether
дослідного
it's relevant or not.
дослідження, так,
But
це
again, as
дуже
part of the
цікаво.
scientific research, yes, this is very interesting.
Потім
Next,
дуже
many
дякую
thanks for the
кластеризації
idea
всередині
about the
кожної
clusterization
групи.
inside each of the
Скоріше за
group.
все,
Most likely,
принаймні найбільш чисельна
At least the biggest group is the Ukrainian private banks, where we have more than 1,400 observations. That will be quite different, because we have already found that some banks are concentrated around giving certain transaction services, and that's absolutely normal. So most likely their behavior will also be different, and it makes sense to consider that as well. And in terms of the heterogeneity, again, many thanks for this remark, but I would like to say that we had more details researched. That's why this problem is somewhat resolved, what you have already paid attention to. But many thanks for the comments, many thanks for pointing out to possible areas of further work for the future. For me, it's very important. Thank you so much for this.
Колеги, дякую дуже.
Colleagues,
Прошу
many thanks.
коментар від
Please, a comment from Viktor Kazyuk. Viktor, the floor is yours. Thank you, Maria. Dear colleagues, welcome. Very interesting. I listened to the speeches of all our respected speakers to the very actual topic. Immediately, I would like to mention two aspects. Number one, in case we talk very laconically and with the orientation towards the policy, not on the execution of the policy, but rather on the policy itself, I think the researchers absolutely reached the result that they have put in front of themselves, and the other details should not be discussed. What I mean, the rate is working in the framework of the transmission. Since the beginning of the war, the rates have become slower, so I believe this is key, the most key message about the presentation. So I believe with this message, we can seriously talk about that we have the result that is absolutely valid, and they absolutely confirm something that many of us intuitively understood, but something that many people, I don't want to say unspecialized professionals, that they don't want to understand. So it seems to me from this point of view, the research has already done its positive work, and the responsive message could be formulated, and then I can only recommend to the center to very actively promote these results. The second point, in case we want to return to a more scientifically based research, putting it in a wider conceptual framework, it's important to take into account a number of other nuances that Dmitro talked about and Roman talked about. So I can add a few moments for myself. On the basis of some micro approaches, we can look and evaluate the input of each of the bank. And there are several institutional aspects which are connected with the fact that the process of cleansing has significantly changed the structural interrelationship between the demand and the offer in the banking sector. And it's clear, once we have the starting positions, that was not adequate from the point of view of the quality of the institutes and GDP per capita figures. Then immediately after the cleansing of the banking system, we can see a significant return to this more equilibrium level of lending compared to what we saw in the countries with the comparable level of quality of the institutions. So the next question arises, how we expected in the behavior of the banks broken down by the types of ownership or some other criteria. And that's the business model truly starts to act a very important role, because the banks, especially private banks, are not homogeneous at all in this aspect, not homogeneous at all. And the peculiarity of the business models and the peculiarities of including such banks into more bigger interaction of the insider connections, they absolutely didn't disappear. They have transformed. They are under some rigid limitations of NBU. The banks are trying to stick to the normatives itself, of the strict insider control, it has not disappeared. So that also poses a question that for the more deep understanding of this issue, we need to take into account this factor of business models that would take into account not only from the deposits, but exactly this nuance that is related to who is the owner, which other businesses this person have. And that requires a lot of serious further intelligence and some good processing of some microdata. Next that I wanted to talk about is about crowding out effect. Honestly speaking, the topic is so actively debated. It is also very hot. It requires a focus. The only thing which I want to ask you, whether this is a standard approach that you have applied in the analysis, I mean the choice of variables for this crowding out effect, or is this your personal know-how? Because I saw this problem a million times. The only thing that I never paid attention, how this could be econometrically proved. So you actually prompted me. I will sit down this evening and I will see how it is implemented in the scientific research. And one other important aspect related to a wider panorama of what's happening. It's exactly when we have specifics of regulation connected with something that the equity ratios are defined on the basis of weighing average risks, then any significant changes in the risk profiles with which the banks are facing, they automatically will affect on how the banks will respond to their management, to their assets, on some exogenic changes in the risk profiles. So that's very much proper that the banks are changing their behavior during the war. The government is changing their behavior from the point of view of the increase of the state debt. And correspondingly, what we say in this effect of crowding out, I would make a certain change, because during COVID and during the war, when we had the depression of the demand and it should be compensated from the stimuli of the public sector, I'm not sure that this is in the pure sense the crowding out effect. To me, it seems like it's active contracyclical reaction of the government to a shock that is manifested in a way that the banking sector assets are changed. So to me, it seems that we should somewhat more in more detail try to formulate this nuance, because it will be looking as if crowding out will be taking place all the time, and there are certain nuances that we should be giving attention. I understand Maria is limiting me in time. Many thanks. Many thanks for the comment. And I'd like to now to pass the floor to Maria Tomilina and also to Iana to respond. And then we have also another colleague who will be commenting the results. And I can see that there are certain questions in the chat, in the Q&A, and the registration. I want still to give the possibility to briefly reply to them. Therefore, please, Maria, Iana, a short response, and then go to Yevgen, to Bahris, and then to Q&A. I will just quickly comment. Thank you so much for your feedback. The crowding out effect, there are different how we could calculate this, and this is somewhat different from what you saw. So yes, we did go our own way, but it also brought some good results. In general, in terms of government bonds, we saw the crowding out effect in the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Then it was going down, faded away. And when we looked at the data, we didn't see it any further. But in general, yes, it's quite valid, this crowding out effect. So we did concentrate it in our work. Many thanks. And I wanted just to thank for the idea. In reality, this is really interesting, and we'll be using this in the future. Yes, thank you so much.
Добре, давайте тепер
Good.
тоді
Then
Євген
let's come
Дубогрис
to
і
Yevhen
коментар з
Dubogris and a few
реєстрації
questions from the
телефону.
registration of Q&A and the chat.
Євгена, будь ласка,
Yevhen, please.
розм'ючуйся.
Please unmute.
Так, окей, щось не працює у Євгена. Колеги, давайте
Something isn't working
наші
for
комунікаційники
Yevgen
пробують
now that our
включити
communications
Євгена до
specialists are
нашої
trying to
дискусії.
connect
Я
Yevgen to our
пару
discussion.
запитання
Let me
задам,
go
які
to some
були при
questions that were
реєстрації задані.
mentioned during
Перше
registration.
запитання,
The first question
напевно,
is
воно буде до
it will
Марії
be
Томіліної,
to
можливо,
Maria
потім
Tomilina,
пані Катерина
and
захоче
maybe
прокоментувати.
possibly Ms.
Чи
Kateryna would like
співпали
to comment
результати
whether
дослідження
the
з тим,
results of the
що
research have
Національний банк
coincided with
писав у
something that the
своєму
National Bank
макроекономічному огляді про
has written in
перекредитування.
their macroeconomic review on lending.
Дякую, Марія, за
Thank you, Maria, for the question.
В цілому мені трошки я прокоментую це таким
Let me
чином.
comment this in such a way.
Основний висновок, який ми
The
отримали після
main
того, що
conclusions that we received
однієї головної
that the
податкової
war
кампанії,
is the
він повністю
main
збігається з тим, що
bottleneck
Національний
for
банк
lending. It
постійно
absolutely
комунікує про
coincides
дефляцію
with
у
what the
своїх
NBU
звітах.
is emphasizing in their reports.
Ось. І
And
щодо інших
also
факторів,
about
наприклад,
other
факторів
factors
витіснення про з боку ОВДП, то
in terms
саме
of the
такими
influence
дефляціями
on
не
government bonds.
я
No,
не
we have
бачила,
not
щоб
seen
Національний банк
this,
їх
that
публікував, можливо, це
the
десь можливо
NBU
було
has
як не
published that.
так не документовано, десь презентовано. Ось. Тому
So
знаєте, і
I can
те саме
say
про трансмісію, це було
that about this
опубліковано, але
transmission,
досить ще давно,
it
з
was
тих
published,
матеріалів,
but
що я
still quite a long
бачила.
time
Ну,
ago
можна
from the
сказати
materials
так,
that I have seen.
основний
We can
висновок,
say the
він
following. The
такий
main
стосується.
conclusion, it is
А інші
supported.
речі, як
Yes,
центральний
the
аудит
other
ефект, це
things,
більше такі вже речі
such as
фундаментальні,
crowded out
які ми
effect, these are
самі
some
дослідили.
complementary things that we have researched ourselves.
Марія, можна я коротко?
Maria,
Так,
allow me
звичайно.
to briefly. I just wanted to say, I wanted to confirm that the main conclusion is supported, that the biggest risk is the war, and to a great extent, these new conditions, it's something that Viktor Kozyuk was talking about. I would shift his accent into the lending. During the war, when other risks are bigger, the impact of the war was the highest. From this crowding out effect, we have shown this effect, and I would agree with colleagues that talked about it that in the beginning of the full-scale invasion difference, and this effect did take place of this potential crowding out, but there were a huge number of other factors that suppressed the demand. And since the banking business is set in such a way that we can't decrease our assets just like that, they can't be, with the absence of the directions of placement, they can't simply shorten their balances. So they are forced to forward them somewhere. Otherwise, many thanks. This research is very much interesting. Thank you, Kateryna.
Зміг панеліст
I
пробитися
think
Євген Дубогрис.
Yevhen
У
Dubogris
нас за 10
has finally
хвилин
joined us. We have 10 minutes
час
left
івенту. Твій
for this
коментар, я
event.
би хотіла
So,
ще пару
Yevhen,
питань
your
все рівно не
comment,
взяти,
and I wanted to
потім
also
тому
ask a few questions from
прошу
Q&A.
до слова.
That's why I would like to ask you to take the floor.
Дякую, Марія. Чутно мене так?
Thank you, Maria. Can you hear me?
Дивіться,
Yes.
насправді ще
Look,
скажу,
in
що дуже
reality,
гарно
what else I
висміяно.
can say,
Тому що,
there is a great research
знаєте,
because,
ви теоретично дійшли
you
насправді до того,
theoretically
що
came to a
звичайно
point
банки плюс
that
міжнародні
the banks
організації, донори,
and
які будуть
international
фінансувати,
organizations,
працюють абсолютно практичним
they
шляхом.
reach
Тобто,
with some
знаєш,
practical
це,
ways,
так сказати, принцип
knowing
топ-даун
that
або
this is the
bottom-up
top-down
analysis. І коли те, і те
principle or
приходить
top-down
до одного
analysis,
висновку, це
and when
означає, що,
one and the other
ну
come
окей,
to the
great
same
minds think
principle,
alike. Про що я кажу? Про те,
it
що
shows that great minds think
наступна
alike.
висновка
That you're
штука,
writing that the
що
main
не
conclusion
вистачає
is that it's not
інструментів
enough instruments,
страхування від військових
such
ризиків,
as insurance from the war
гарантій
risks,
іншого,
guarantees,
і це, в
and
принципі,
the
ключові
others, and
чинники
that's some
відновлення
key
кредитування, принаймні на цьому етапі. Це
factors
абсолютно
for the
так, тому що от ми бачимо,
recovery lending.
банки,
We see
які,
that the banks
загалом не
that
мають
in
проблем з
general
ліквідністю,
don't have the
мають
problem with
доступні
liquidity,
ресурси,
they have
вони все
available
одно йдуть і
resources. In any
беруть
case, they
для
go
їхніх
and they
балансів
take where
копійки,
their
є не
balances.
копійки, але, умовно
Of
кажучи, для
course, it's
сейля,
not
для їх
CapEx in URD,
люксембуржців
but
вийшли
you
там
say it,
Ощадбанка по 20 мільйонів.
for
Це
Okhrimenko they
копійки.
made 20
Але вони все
million.
одно йдуть, тому що
but they still come because these instruments guarantees. These are the instruments that are related to insurance of risks. They allow to banks to decrease cost of risks and go. In case your NPL ratio is 10%, now it's report. And if it's 10%, there is no such rate on the market where the bank will not make the lending. Once the bank sees the possibility to hedge it with a guarantee or with some partial compensation of the lending rates, as we planned to do in USAID, it didn't work out, or at the expense of the insurance of the war risks, the banks are really trying and running to get it. So it's really good that you came to this conclusion, and it's important to present it further. In case we go over these conclusions, all of this, USAID, DFC, we did a lot. And I can say immediately, the trainings, there is no impact from the business. If the business needs to finance at least 70%, it's coming like this. If it's just a free lunch, then the lending does not increase from that. Also, regarding item 3, it's most likely as far as I'm concerned, you simply formulated it. You talk more about the alternatives to the banking financing. So it's credit unions, factoring, it's leasing, it's all of these other things that you can principally do as a further improvement for lending. As the crowding out effect, I don't want to go into theoretical discussions. I didn't see that myself that much. Together with the SAS colleagues, we discussed it a lot, that the observers or governments is the same competitors for the banking lending, same as hence our competitors to legs. They're important and they live together. But that's the next one. Now, in terms of the recommendations, what I wanted to say, why this research? If I were at the MBU, I would call you and I would not get off you until I clarified how you received these conclusions. What was the influence on lending? So, in your theory, they don't have any influence, but they did have this influence. So the question is, what has happened that the instrument that, conventionally speaking, it's white penguins and bears, they live from different poles, why they interact, what needs to be done so that it doesn't happen. So it's a symptom that is very much endangering. Second question, why the capital doesn't have significant impact on lending. So it's very difficult to understand. The banks are profitable, the banks have the stock reserve of the capital, but I also looked at it from the this point of view. I talked to the directors of the departments of lending, and they were looking at me with really frightened eyes, and they said, how to lend the capital? That's a risk. We don't do this. We don't use our capital. And that's for us as the policy application to talk to the banks, because they are giving the capital not to sit on it. This capital is the basis for lending. You can't do it without the capital, and we should work with this capital. And there are quite a lot of other things in the report where you found something new, something that it's really worth talking more about it. I could talk more, but we need to wrap up now. And therefore, these conclusions are made by econometrics. This is about the policy formation, especially oversight policies, the stability oversight, like a horse and carriage, is very important. I would like to really recommend this to understand why you have such conclusions and how to make it in such a way that the profitable banks would really be lending with capital. Maybe the national bank is being too strict towards the banks that requires from them to have the zero NPL ratio. Possibly, I don't know how it will be, but this will be exactly the possibility
може щось з цього буде цікаво. Дякую.
Дякую дуже,
It's
Євгене.
only question
Давайте, я не знаю, насправді я не думаю, що
how
тут
the
зараз
National Bank
треба
can help with this.
реагувати
And
от
that's
прямо
it.
в рамках цієї дискусії, але ми, правда, дуже вдячні за ці коментарі. Будемо вдячні також, звісно, за письмовий відгук. Можливо, колеги зможуть це врахувати в подальших дослідженнях. І зараз в нас залишилося там кілька хвилин. Є пара запитань, які якраз дуже сильно перегукуються з тим, що ти, Євген, сказав щойно. Запитання з реєстрації. І останнім запитанням я спробую закінчити з Q&A, якщо буде ще на це час. Отже, питання з реєстрації, їх одразу два, які стосуються country risk, які стосуються страхування військових ризиків. How can we address investors' concerns related to country risks? І чи є інформація про широту застосування механізму risk-sharing в Україні? І хто основні іноземні гравці? Тобто, яким чином, переформулюю, яким чином можливо зниження цих ризиків, що банки несуть, і цього фактору війни, який кредитуванню заважає. І, напевне, я попрошу Катерину або Первін, або вас обох відреагувати.
Дякую. Ну, давайте почнемо з того, які інструменти є. Наразі зараз ми бачимо, що є ряд проєктів, і розуміємо, що потенційно вони ще можуть з'являтися. Ті, які translation десь пропав, пишуть в чаті. Ряд проєктів по страхуванню інвестицій чи страхуванню від військових ризиків, які здійснюються разом з великими міжнародними гравцями в цьому секторі, такими як МІГА, такими як DFC. Це переважно проєкти великого корпоративного бізнесу, і Міністерство економіки досить серйозно працює з нашими міжнародними партнерами, але це не проекти роздрібу. Тобто про що йде мова? Для того, аби застрахувати той чи інший об'єкт, інвестиційний об'єкт або ж об'єкт, який передається в заставу, необхідно пройти досить серйозні процедури комплайнсу. І це не завжди під силу середньому і малому бізнесу. Такі проєкти є, такі проєкти будуть, знову ж таки, але це не масовий ринок. Якщо говорити про портфельні гарантії, що більш доступне малому і середньому бізнесу, то це сьогодні банки переважно користуються державними гарантіями в рамках програми 5-7-9. Разом з тим на ринку є гарантії, які надаються EBRD, IFC, Європейським інвестиційним банком, фондом підтримки, фондом часткового гарантування в сільському господарстві. Ну, це теж квазідержавна гарантія. Тому такі напрямки наразі є, вони більш роздрібні, вони є портфельні, рівень за ними збитків незначний, досить низький. Разом з тим треба сказати, що подібні гарантії майже не поширюються на зони підвищеного ризику або на регіони стійкості, як ми їх називаємо. Це регіони, які чи території, які безпосередньо знаходяться в близькості від лінії зіткнення, від лінії фронту, і там зазвичай такі гарантії вже не працюють. Якщо говорити про класичне страхування від військових ризиків, то наразі воно представлене дуже мало в Україні. Вітчизняний страховий ринок не має достатнього запасу капіталу для того, щоб брати на себе такі ризики, тобто ємність ринку дуже низька. Тому в цьому напрямку робота ведеться. Ви, напевно, всі знаєте про законопроект про створення системи страхування військових ризиків, який якраз і спрямований на те, аби це питання вирішити. Переважно він має на меті забезпечити страхування, в першу чергу, застави для малого середнього бізнесу, а також застави по іпотеці, що з нашої точки зору суттєво би, по-перше, оживило ринок, і підвищило би і попит, і відповідно пропозицію, і спростило би доступ до кредитів, тому що сьогодні банки заставу оцінюють нижче, ніж вона могла би бути оцінена, саме через ризик руйнування або знищення. Якщо я відповіла на запитання, то я щаслива.
Я думаю, так. Колеги, в нас вже час нашого вебінару, на жаль, вичерпався. Я можу продовжити задати ще там кілька питань, буквально, не знаю, на 5-10 хвилин, бо є справді питання з реєстрації, питання в Q&A. Якщо ви можете залишитися ще на пару хвилиночок, то, будь ласка, давайте залишимося. І давайте ще буде запитання з Q&A зараз. Could you please describe how you see the reconstruction affecting the need demand for corporate financing and the banking sector's ability to support this through lending? А я думаю, що це також запитання до пані Катерини чи пані Первін. А якщо ви готові, то, будь ласка.
Так, ми готові. Насправді питання це ми широко обговорюємо зараз. І головне питання, яке, тобто в нас немає ніяких консернів стосовно стабільності фінансового сектору. Ми бачимо, і ви самі це показували, що він є достатньо ліквідним і капіталізованим для того, аби підтримувати економіку, в тому числі під час відновлення. На сьогоднішній день запас кредитування в цілому по сектору складає близько 1 трильйона гривень. І це дуже великий обсяг, тобто кредитний портфель може бути збільшений більш ніж в 2 рази. Разом з тим, звичайно, рівень капіталізації сектору є порівняно невисоким, якщо порівнювати навіть з Польщею. І це говорить про певні обмеження, коли мова йде про фінансування великих проєктів, які більш того, проєктів, які вимагають довгострокової реалізації. Зараз ми говоримо про ліміт кредитування в одні руки. І тут хочу відзначити нашу банківську спільноту, вони великі молодці, вони вже навіть під час війни почали активно використовувати такий механізм, як консорціумне кредитування, яке дозволяє кредитувати проєкти значні, які один банк в силу обмежень пруденційних не може собі дозволити. Тому цей інструмент, ми сподіваємося, буде і надалі розвиватися і інституціалізуватися в секторі як такому. І, звичайно, для того, аби забезпечити рекавері після перемоги, в нас є завдання і є навіть це в стратегії, це питання ринків капіталу. Це питання його моделі, його трошки перезавантаження для того, щоб інструменти ринку капіталу були доступні інвесторам, як зовнішнім, так і внутрішнім, для залучення необхідного ресурсу.
Дуже дякую, пані Катерино. І насправді давайте будемо завершувати цей дзвінок. Я бачу зараз тут запитання технічні досить багато в чаті від Анни Куліш. Хороші питання, всі по моделях, всі по тому, як що там враховано, дуже технічні. Я дуже прошу, ви напишіть нам, будь ласка, на пошту, і ми будемо раді і прислати специфікації, прислати моделі, показати всі дані і всі змінні, як і що конструювалося, там, зокрема, propensity to corporate lending і так далі. Всім решті я дуже дякую за сьогоднішню подію. Я дуже дякую, що ви погодилися бути з нами ці кілька годин. І сподіваюся, що ваш вечір і ніч буде безпечними, і ви не забудете задонатити на протиповітряну оборону сьогодні.
Дуже дякую, Маш Цес. Вам дуже дякуємо за дослідження і будемо продовжувати з вами в тому ж напрямку. Дякую.